Welcome to Yellow Chair Collective. My name is Helen Garcia. My pronouns are she, her, and today I have one of our associate marriage and family therapists on the show, Mina Yoon. Today, Mina and I discuss the various aspects of ADHD, personal growth, and growing up with emotionally immature parents. We talk about dropping hobbies, sustaining focus at work, managing deadlines, consequences, dealing with forgetfulness, and being honest with our clients. We explore the symptoms of ADHD, what it means to have a parent with a personality disorder, and how to turn those adversities into strengths. We find motivation in low points, and if you're someone that really struggles with accepting their ADHD diagnosis, accepting their shortcomings, this might be the episode for you. Some of the things that you will get out of this episode is how ADHD can lead to hyperfocus on hobbies, but it's also important to recognize when interest is waning and be okay with it, how to sustain focus at work when it's challenging, and how to overcome a lot of poor self-esteem issues when growing up with adversity. So let's start today's episode. And thank you for listening to the Yellow Chair Collective podcast. So this is actually, this is actually my first in-person interview in a while.
Oh, yeah?
Yeah. Oh. I think you're my first YCC in-person interview.
Oh, cool. Yeah. What an honor.
So Mina, I always like to frame our podcast interviews from a human-centered lens. And then I kind of want to go into your specialties as an EIP, emotionally immature parent therapist, and someone who's got diagnosed with ADHD late. But if you could travel back to any point in history, what point in history would it be and why?
Not in my history, but just in history in general.
History in general, or your own personal history if you want.
Actually, I had this thought the other day that I really enjoyed preschool. Yeah, when I was 3 or 4, I feel like I was my most authentic self then. I went to preschool and I just remember the lunches were so good. I went to a Korean preschool, in America. And so they served a lot of Korean food. And I just remember I would always look forward to that. And then I had a lot of friends that I would just run around with. And I felt like I was queen of the playground. Yeah. And I just remember just feeling so happy and carefree. And even though I was only 3 or 4, it's one of my most vivid memories.
Really?
Preschool days, yeah.
What was Mina like without any, anything? In your purest form, what are you like?
I remember I laughed a lot, so much so that my mom would always joke oh, you're going to choke because I was laughing so hard.
I always like to frame our podcast interviews from a human-centered lens, and then I kind of want to go into your specialties as an EIP, emotionally immature parent therapist, and someone who's got diagnosed with ADHD late. But if you could travel back to any point in history, what point in history would it be and why?
Not in my history, but just in history in general.
History in general, or your own personal history if you want.
Actually, I had this thought the other day that I really enjoyed preschool. Yeah, when I was 3 or 4, I feel like I was my most authentic self then. I went to preschool and I just remember the lunches were so good. I went to a Korean preschool, in America. And so they served a lot of Korean food. And I just remember I would always look forward to that. And then I had a lot of friends that I would just run around with. And I felt like I was queen of the playground. Yeah. And I just remember just feeling so happy and carefree. And even though I was only 3 or 4, it's one of my most vivid memories.
Really?
Preschool days, yeah.
What was Mina like without any, anything? In your purest form, what are you like?
I remember I laughed a lot, so much so that my mom would always joke oh, you're going to choke because I was laughing so hard. And at church, some of the older people, they would nickname me Giggles because I was always laughing.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like I laughed really easily. I was very social. which is interesting because I kind of consider myself a shy person or like an introverted person, but I remember I was really social. But my mom did tell me that when I first went to preschool for like the first 6 months or so, the teachers there, the principal, thought that I couldn't speak because I didn't talk. But then my cousin came to the preschool later, and then they were like shocked because I was talking so much.
No way.
Yeah, and I don't remember that. I remember me being talkative.
Okay.
But, yeah.
So you were shy when it came to like systems, but like with other kids, you were pretty free and easygoing.
I think so. Yeah, I think I was always shy with like adults or in like any institutions or systems, but with people I was comfortable with, I was very like outgoing and talkative and chatty and like, kind of crazy.
I love your laugh, Mina. It's so refreshing.
Thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so I kind of want to go into what you specialize in because for the audience that's listening, I feel like a lot of people would really benefit from your specialty and the work that you've personally done as someone who did grow up with an emotionally immature parent who was diagnosed late with ADHD. I want to frame you from a human context. But first, I kind of want people to understand, like, what was your motivation to become a therapist? Like, how did you get into that?
So I remember in 6th grade, I read this book just by chance. I don't remember how I came across it, but it was this book about a psychologist's mom and her anorexic daughter and just kind of like their journey together. And I remember I read that and I was like, oh, like I want to major in psychology when I go to college.
Wow.
Yeah, and then that just never changed. And then I got to college, I did major in psychology. And then some of my professors there were practicing MFTs on the side.
Marriage family therapist.
Yeah. Which is what I am. And they would, sometimes like talk about their practice as like relevant to the curriculum. Yeah. And I just remember thinking like, oh, like that's what I want to do. And, yeah, that's just kind of how I decided. And so I did end up going to grad school for an MFT program. And that's the answer that I usually tell people when they ask this question. But that's kind of a half truth. So all that is true.
You're getting the juicy details in today's episode.
But I think, like, when I think back on it, like, in 6th grade, I wasn't, conscious of it. But I think what it was that, like, as a kid, I myself dealt with a lot of depression, anxiety, difficult family dynamics. And so I think because of those reasons, I was drawn to psychology and therapy and things like that. And I think that's why, like, in 6th grade, that even, like, caught my interest, that book. And that never changed because it was so like pervasive in my life, just mental health and family dynamics.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah. I relate to that a lot because that's what drew me to books. Because I remember just like reading, there was this book about a woman with bipolar. I don't have bipolar, but it was almost as if like her experience and her picture of what pain looked like for her, I could relate. And so I think that like when I meet different therapists and they do have the capacity to be honest, it's really refreshing because I feel seen in your story, And so did you go to UCLA for your undergrad and then you also went to get your master's at UCLA as well?
No, UCLA doesn't have an MFT program.
Oh, okay.
So I went to Hope International University in Fullerton for MFT program.
Wow. But how did you end up here in LA?
Well, I graduated undergrad at UCLA, and then I just kind of stayed there because I was also working in LA.
Oh, the pandemic hit, and then you had to go online?
The pandemic hit, I think, after my first semester of grad school.
Okay.
So I was living and working in LA, but then I went to school in Fullerton.
Gotcha. So you had to make the drive over.
Yeah, but it was just once a week. So
okay, not bad. So was it a part-time program?
Yeah, I did the part-time track because I was also working at the same time.
Gotcha. Okay, understood. Anyways, that's not relevant to what we want to talk about. Let's kind of go into like emotionally immature parents, and then let's kind of talk about your late diagnosis with ADHD. But I want to go into like, can you go into what an emotionally immature parent is and what a lot of people think is their issue when they're going into therapy with you, and like what are some things that you look for? So break down like EIP for me, and then let's go into that. Yeah.
Okay. So an emotionally immature parent is actually pretty self-explanatory.
Yeah.
It's a parent. So an adult that is emotionally immature, like they are a child. So when we think about children, a lot of children, especially younger ones, are very like self-centric, right? Very much focused on like my own emotions and what's going on for me and what I want, but then not like quite able to see other people's emotions and the dynamics like between us, right? So it's kind of like an adult body with a child stuck inside.
Wow.
And commonly, like what kind of people might fall under an EIP, what we commonly see are people who struggle with alcohol abuse, or people who have narcissistic tendencies, like very strong narcissistic tendencies, maybe like not bipolar, borderline personality. Those are just some like common examples to kind of like give you a picture of that. And there's a book by Lindsay Gibson, because you're a big reader, I know. And it's called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents.
Yeah.
And she goes into the whole enchilada about like what tendencies or traits that EIPs might have, what tendencies or traits that you might have as an adult child of an EIP, how you may have learned to cope with that, how it may affect your relationships and your life as an adult. Yeah, it's a good book. It is written by a white person, so it's not like the most
it gets.
Yeah, so it's not the most like culturally sensitive, or not the most like culturally specific, but there are a lot of good parts that, you know, I think anyone could, or anyone who is an adult child of an EIP might be able to relate to, and some like tools and things that you could pick up.
Yeah. So if someone's listening to this and they have a parent who did suffer from alcohol abuse, who had traits of narcissism and self-centeredness, what are some things that you look for as an adult child of an EIP?
What do you mean? What
like if a client says to you like, yeah, my dad was an alcoholic, or my dad or my mom had narcissistic traits, where every conversation was always about how they were feeling. What are some symptoms and signs of an adult child of an emotionally immature parent?
So I think my specialty lies a little bit more in narcissistic parents rather than parents who have alcohol. And one thing, I think one big telltale sign of a parent with narcissistic traits or tendencies is that they view you, the child, as an extension of themselves rather than as an individual person. And I think in a lot of Asian families, like there is some level of that, but with an adult child of an EIP, or, you know, of a narcissistic parent, it's extreme. It's like very extreme. And I think with even in a lot of Asian families where there is some level of that, like as the child grows into an adult, the trust grows and the independence grows. But with like an adult child of an EIP, some things we might see are like, they might be a full-fledged adult, right? Like, you know, maybe like 30s, married, have kids, but they're like, oh, I'm afraid to tell my mom that I got a tattoo. Or I don't want to tell my mom that, you know, I bought this car, or I'm going to dress a certain way when I go see my mom or my dad.
Wow.
Because the adult child is also still stuck in that childhood. Like my parent still has this
control.
Yeah, this control, this power over me. And I think that's one of the biggest telltale signs that I might notice.
Yeah. Because I feel like, as I understood it, there's also this level of, I'm taking care of my parent too, right? Like
emotionally. Well, rather than taking care of my parent, it's a lot of like, I'm doing things to protect myself from them. So like I'm doing things to avoid upsetting them. I'm doing things to avoid the verbal abuse, to avoid them criticizing me for even like the most normal things, like, you know, I just put on this outfit that I like, or, you know, I'm working a certain job, right? So it's a lot of like tiptoeing around them, walking on eggshells, hypervigilance.
Wow. So if someone's listening to this and they're going, holy smokes, like I think I might have a parent with a narcissistic personality disorder because I'm noticing all of these things coming up in my life. If someone isn't ready to go to therapy but wants to start on the path of recovery, how would you suggest that they start to do that?
So they're not wanting to, or they're not ready for therapy yet, but then still wanting to go on the path of recovery. I think, well, learning, just a lot of, like if it tickles your fancy, you can do like your own research about like EIP, about adult children of EIP, about like narcissistic personality disorder. And then you can do a lot of self-reflection about like, how has that impacted me? In what ways does that show up in my relationships? Like romantic relationships, friendships, work relationships, in my relationship to work, relationship to self, even the way you do hobbies. Because something like that, an experience like that, complex trauma, it's extremely pervasive. Like it affects every little crevice of your life.
What is complex trauma?
So when I think when people typically think of trauma, we think of like big T trauma, right? Which is like you were in a natural disaster or in war, or maybe you suffered sexual assault, right? So these like significant like one-time events, I think, are what people typically think of. But complex trauma is more of like a series, like a consistent, regular occurrence in your life. So I think a good example is like if you grew up with an emotionally or verbally abusive parent, right? That's not something that happens once, and that's like one traumatic event, but it's just kind of your life.
Wow. So it's kind of like a series of small interactions that end up leading to you losing your sense of identity, losing your sense of control, etc. Okay. And so going into what you were saying about, you know that you are a child of an emotionally immature parent if you've been through this type of complex trauma, where the reason why it's also complex, as I'm understanding you say it, is this is also your mom or your dad or your caretaker. And the fact that you're having to like change or shift a sense of your identity affects the way that you see yourself and your own self-worth and capabilities. And the reason why I asked you in the question earlier, if someone isn't ready, is I don't know if this is your experience, but a lot of the clients from my experience have taken years of just being in and out of therapy, not really knowing what the issue. And there's a level of complexity being an Asian American suffering with these mental health issues and thinking that it's your issue. And so as a child of an EIP, I feel like there's a lot of self-blame that goes into play. And then there's also a lot of confusion about, I don't want to hate my parent, right? So how do you go about like helping someone understand that or like welcoming all of that in?
Yeah. Well, I'll speak to my own experience with that. I think for a lot of children who grow up with an EIP, we don't know that this is not normal.
Wow.
Because it is normal. Like it is your normal.
So good.
Right? Like for me, like I grew up this way. And so I thought like, oh, this is normal. This is like, I honestly would think like, oh, this is just how Korean dads are. This is just how it is. And my dad maybe happens to be a little worse than others, but like this is normal.
It's normal to your experience. Yeah. I like that distinction.
Yeah. And I think I never put the word abuse to that until I became an adult.
Wow. What was that like for you?
It was very strange. Like, I think, so when I first started therapy, like going to therapy myself as a client, also happened to be the year that I had started the MFT program. A lot.
A lot to take in.
And my therapist was the one that named it for me.
Wow.
Saying that, you know, like I mean, obviously she can't diagnose my dad as, you know, she doesn't know him, but she was saying like, you know, it sounds like he displays a lot of narcissistic traits.
Wow.
And I was like, oh my God, what? I was kind of shook.
Yeah.
And she would name like, you know, certain experiences I told her about as abuse. And at first I was like, I don't know. Like I was hesitant to kind of claim that.
That's so real.
Yeah, because I felt like, I don't know, like he never hit me or like, you know, like I thought of like the big T trauma. And I thought like, I don't know if I can call that abuse. Like I don't feel like, you know, I feel like that takes away from the real trauma, like people with real trauma. Yeah, so I think at first I was kind of like hesitant to even claim that. But I went home and I did my own research. Like I looked up narcissistic personality disorder and like the traits. And I found stuff online about EIP. And I found myself relating so much to like all of the content that I found.
It's almost like how you navigate helping someone understand the complexity that comes with knowing that your parent was an EIP. But I love what you just said, because I also have a parent that has narcissistic personality traits, and I've been through my own experience of that type of confusion where like, that's my parent and I really love my parent. And like, for the purpose of this podcast, like I want to protect my parents' identity because we have worked through a lot of those issues. But it took me years to understand like, oh, this is actually abuse. And I need to draw boundaries in my relationship with my parent. And like, I'm curious about what that was like for you to like hear your therapist say that and to deal with a lot of that complexity as a person. Because obviously like I have my own story and you have your own story, but narcissistic abuse it's hard.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah. So like even as my therapist named that for me, and eventually I came around and I was like, oh my gosh, you're so right.
Yeah.
You know, I think there's still, and maybe not just Asian cultures, but like many different cultures too, there's still the sense of like familial piety. And also like with a parent, you know, it's like, it's much harder than just cutting off like an ex or a friend. And there is still this sense of, I think, guilt involved with like setting maybe more rigid boundaries, or especially like growing up as a child of an EIP or like a child of a narcissistic parent. You never say no to them.
Yes.
You never say no.
Yes, you always work around them.
Yeah, you work around them, you keep secrets, you hide things, you just say yes, you just do it. And so for me to like set boundaries, I think for a lot of people, I think what I find is that they see setting boundaries as very black and white.
Yes.
It's either we're like best friends, I'm best friends with my parent, or, you know, really close with my parent, or I have to cut them off. But like, that's not the case, you know? There's like a whole spectrum in between. And it's really about like what you are comfortable with, what you have the capacity for, what's good for you. And so, I mean, like in my case, I've just decided that for the sake of my mental health, I cannot live with my parents. Even though that would save so much money. But yeah, I cannot live with my parents. And then I also, when I was younger, I would visit them a lot more often, like once a month, one weekend a month. But now that, you know, I think I've come a long way. Now I see them maybe like twice a year. And like one thing that I did for myself is Christmas is my favorite holiday. Like I love Christmas. So I decided like, I don't want to go home on Christmas because it's a happy day and I don't want to risk feeling like all the shame and just being criticized and abused and questioned, interrogated by my dad on Christmas or around that season. So I compromised by, you know, I'll go home for Thanksgiving because I still want to see my mom, but not going home on Christmas. So yeah, like with clients, and also at Yellow Chair, shameless plug.
Yellow Chair Collective.
We have an adult children of EIP support group.
Do you facilitate that?
I co-facilitate that.
Cool.
We just had our first iteration at the end of last year, and then we have one upcoming soon in March.
Mina's giving y'all eye contact.
So yeah, what I hear from a lot of people is that there's a lot of guilt surrounding that, and just I don't want to just cut off my parent, even though they do hurt me, right? And I think maybe like a strength that adult children with EIP have is like a lot of empathy. And I think what I like to remind my clients of is that you can have empathy and put yourself first too. Like you can have empathy and set boundaries.
Yeah.
And the purpose of boundaries is not to cut someone off or distance yourself, but to preserve the relationship, right? Like you're setting boundaries because that's what you need in order to stay in this relationship. And so for me, like in order to have somewhat of a relationship with my dad, is that I just can't see him much.
Yeah. I think it's like figuring out, to your point, what is it that's going to preserve the relationship? And for both of us, we both had to move out of our parents' house in order to preserve that type of relationship. And it's also figuring out, okay, what is it that I do and don't share with this parent? And that doesn't mean that you love them less. It just means that this is what I need to preserve my own self-identity.
Yeah.
And so going into the second point of what I wanted to talk about is, did that type of dynamic growing up keep you from learning about your ADHD, do you think?
You know, so I was diagnosed with ADHD at age 30, so very late in life.
Wow. You look really good, by the way. I would mistake you for 21, for those of you not watching.
So I was diagnosed really late in life. I don't want to say that it was like the whole EIP dynamic that prevented that. I think it was simply just like the lack of awareness and lack of knowledge.
Yeah.
Like in general, ADHD, especially in BIPOC and especially in girls and women, is severely like under and misdiagnosed.
Especially Asian women.
Yeah. So I think it was probably that mostly that, you know, my parents, I'm sure, like just didn't really have much like knowledge or information about that to even think to like, oh, like get her evaluated. And then also at school too, what we find is that a lot of kids who do well in school, they fly under the radar, even though they may actually have ADHD. Because when we think of ADHD, typically we think of like a little boy, super hyperactive, bouncing off the walls, can't sit still.
Right.
But, you know, there's two main types of ADHD. There's like the inattentive type, and then there's the hyperactive type. The hyperactive type. And then there's a combined presentation.
Yeah.
But what people typically think of is that hyperactive type where, you know, can't sit still, like you're always like moving. But then, especially for girls, I think there's like, you know, the way that we're socialized too. You gotta sit still, gotta listen to the teacher. And especially like I think for Asian kids, like you gotta listen to the teacher. And like when you're inattentive or have trouble focusing, it's not visible often, you know, it's not visibly, or it's not often visible to the eye.
Yeah.
And so, especially if you're like doing okay in school, you kind of just fly under the radar.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did really well in school, in elementary school. And then I even went to, for middle school and high school, I went to this like college preparatory school that you have to test into.
Wow.
So I did well up until then, but once I got there, I struggled so hard because I think in elementary school, there wasn't a lot of like effort required or like a lot of sustained focus required. But once I got to 7th grade, that was required and I couldn't do it. So I actually did really badly in school. And then in college too, I did really terribly.
Really? I'm surprised by that.
I did really terribly. And I don't tell people this, but my GPA was so low that it was under the requirement, the minimum requirement for most grad schools.
Really?
Yeah. And even my grad school, the one that I went to, I didn't do a group interview for the admissions process, but I did a individual one because that's what they required for people with under
low GPAs.
Yeah, under the minimum GPA. So
you did great.
So I actually did really terribly because I just could not get myself to focus.
Wow.
And I always thought like, oh, it's because, you know, I'm lazy or it's because I'm depressed and anxious.
Wow.
And I thought that up until like age 30,
Wow.
when a couple of therapists actually, like my first therapist suggested like, hey, like, what do you think about ADHD? And I was like, nah. And my second therapist, my current one actually, she also brought it up and I was like, I don't think so. I think I'm just anxious.
Yeah.
Because, you know, a lot of the symptoms of depression, anxiety, ADHD, they can look similar, right? Like the difficulty focusing, the lack of motivation, the forgetfulness. So I thought like, no, I think I'm just anxious. But once I actually started taking antidepressants to address, to help manage my depression and anxiety. And once those are really like significantly reduced and, you know, I was doing really well with that side of things, my therapist brought it up again saying like, you know, like we're still seeing these things happen. What do you think about ADHD? And then she specializes in it. And so she, you know, brought to my attention like things that I've mentioned in the past that have happened or I've done that made her think that. And I was like, oh, maybe.
Wow.
And so that's how I got evaluated. So yeah, sorry, long-winded answer.
No, I love this.
But in short, I actually don't think, at least not that I've, you know, made any connections that the EIP thing really had an effect. But I think it's more of that general lack of knowledge, awareness, and research in like women, girls, people of color.
I love that. You know, I love the reason why I said that I really loved listening to your story was because I think that you hear that a lot with people. Even as a therapist, I hear that often of, if I already know I have it, what's the point of getting evaluated? Like, it's not really going to help me. But to your point, I think for a lot of people, it makes you feel less stupid and less stigmatized and less not enough, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And with ADHD is one big thing is shame. There's a lot of shame.
Yeah.
And like, I feel like I have this potential, but I'm not meeting it. And like, oh, I think I'm just lazy, or why can't I get myself to do this? Why can't I be like other people? There's so much shame. But I think just getting that diagnosis, you know, doesn't completely eliminate that shame in a lot of cases, but I think it does help resolve a lot of it. And it is very validating. And so when I look back now, like in light of this diagnosis, when I look back at like how I did in college, how I did in high school and middle school, I have more compassion for myself. Whereas before, I just had so much shame and I would never tell anyone about my grades because I was embarrassed.
Oh. I'm curious about this. Like, did you ever experience hyperfocus on things that you did like? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that I actually find that I enjoy about ADHD is that hyperfocus. Because if I find something I like or I'm interested in, I'll like latch on, you know?
Yeah.
And that happens to me a lot with hobbies. So for a time, there was a time that I was really into beading. Like I would make beaded jewelry and like mask straps. And this was revealing another secret here. But back when I was working I worked as a translator before. So just like, you know.
Korean translator? Okay.
Like back when I would just, you know, do like all day.
Yeah.
There were times when I would just bead for a few hours instead of translating. So I was like, I can't stop. Even though like my eyes were like bulging and my back was hurting. But I just had so much fun.
Yeah, you lose track of time, I heard.
And then right now I'm really into true crime. So I just constantly have like true crime YouTube videos or like documentaries playing.
That's so cool.
So I do feel like what's been great is that like I've gotten to experience a lot of different hobbies or a lot of different interests. And it's just fun.
So the common thing I always hear about people with ADHD is you pick up a hobby and you drop it. Is that true?
Yes.
Yes.
It's very common. And also for my experience, very true. I'll like suddenly gain this interest in something and then I'll impulsively buy everything that I need for it.
Okay.
Like I also went through a nail phase.
Cool.
Where I was like, oh my gosh, I'm going to do my own nails. So I spent like $200
okay.
buy all the supplies. And then
so cool.
I would spend like 4 hours doing my nails. And then within a couple months, I was like, I can't do this anymore. I dropped it. It's just under my bed now. All this stuff.
Are you cognizant of when you drop the hobby? Do you just lose interest one day, or is it like slow and progressively you just kind of stop doing it?
I think when I was younger, I was not cognizant at all. Okay. It just kind of happened and I didn't really think much of it. Okay. But now that I'm older, I like, even before the diagnosis, I was aware of my patterns. And I knew when I had this like impulsive need to buy everything to start this new hobby. Yeah. I knew like, but I don't know how long this is going to last, but I need to do it. So I would do it. And then, you know, I'm like really into it. And then there comes a point where I feel,
Okay. So part 2, we're continuing this episode because we got kicked out from our original room, but Mina and I are back and we're talking about ADHD, dropping hobbies. So Mina, you said that you got into nails, you got into got into beading.
Yeah. So I now as an adult, now that I'm more aware of my cycles and patterns, and now that I have the diagnosis, I am aware that like, I know that this hobby is going to end soon at some point. Okay. And I can feel like when I'm starting to slowly lose interest, like I lose the obsessiveness. And I'm like, oh, it's coming to an end soon. And then I just let it. Yeah. Before I think I felt more guilt about it, especially if I had to invested money. But then now I'm just like, it's okay. I'm losing interest. I'll find something else. It's okay.
Interesting. So, okay. As someone with ADHD who has gotten hyper-focused in different hobbies, how do you look at work? Because there is this cultural expectation that work has to be something you're passionate about. How do you see that?
Well, I think one thing that I struggled with a lot is sustaining focus, whether it was school or work. Yeah. But so something that really helps ADHDers is when there are consequences and deadlines. And so when it comes to work things, a lot of times we'll find that people with ADHD, like, they might be doing okay, or at least when you look at the end results, like they still meet the deadlines, they still produce like decent work. It just may be the process that is stressful for them because they might be procrastinating till the very last minute. Or it might be, you know, painstaking to get yourself to do it. And I found that, especially when I was doing like my translating job, it was really hard for me to, you know, sustain focus. It was just like such a drag. Like I would be looking at the clock all day. But in this work, it's a little different because our schedules are more irregular and I'm not just like sitting at the computer, like typing all day. So while like in my personal life, I admit like sometimes I'm late to things, but with work, because there are like consequences, deadlines, and I also tend to be generally a little more like high anxiety too, even though I am managing that. So I'm never like late to any like sessions. I'm really like very serious about, you know, being organized and just like doing a good job. But there will be times where I slip. And that was like one of the things that my current therapist had mentioned, because there were a couple times that I had slipped and I felt so much guilt and so much shame about that.
When you say slipped, what do you mean?
I'm very ashamed to admit, but so there would be times where, you know, I might have like a consultation call and then we'll schedule an intake. And normally my process would be like, as soon as we're done with the call, I'll put it into my calendar, send them the link, all that stuff, and I'm good, right? As long as it's my calendar, I'll make it. But then sometimes for some reason, I might not. I don't know why. It just slips my brain. I don't. Yeah. And then in those cases, like I just totally forget, like, oh, I had something scheduled. And then there was a time where I like somehow just accidentally realized, oh my God, I have a session, an intake session, no less. And then I thankfully made it. Yeah. But I was just not as prepared, like mentally, emotionally prepared as I would like to be. Or there might be a time if, like, let's say I regularly meet a client at like, you know, Monday, 2 p.m. or something, but then let's say they rescheduled for that week for, you know, some reason. I might have just totally forgotten. Well, those kind of things happen very rarely because I like am so meticulous about not letting that happen.
Yeah.
But there have been times those kind of things happened and I just felt so much like I can feel my face flush red and like my stomach drops and I like want to cry because I just feel so bad and so ashamed. I think especially like being a therapist, I feel like there's a lot of pressure and like I don't ever want to make anyone, like my clients especially, feel forgotten or abandoned or like I don't care or that I'm careless or they can't trust me. At the same time I have to remind myself like I'm human too, and the way that I address that with them can also be therapeutic. And so to just be honest with them that like, oh my gosh, like I'm so sorry, I totally forgot that we rescheduled at this time, and then just reschedule again. And usually people are really understanding, and to just like be honest and to just also again like apologize and own up to it, I think has helped me personally a lot to help mitigate some of that shame.
It just helps me understand that everyone has their own battle that they're going through that we might not know about. I had an English teacher say that to me because I used to struggle with being late, but I don't think I have ADHD. And that was my follow-up question to you, is that like on TikTok and on mainstream media, ADHD in a good way is now being broadcasted. But similar to really popular diagnosis, I think narcissism is like a really popular diagnosis now. How do you like to approach that with clients that might be coming and thinking they have ADHD? Like, what's the difference between someone who's just forgetful and anxious and someone with ADHD?
Well, with any client that comes in and they're like, oh, I'm wondering if I have this, right? I always want to take them seriously, and not just brush it off as like, it's just TikTok pop psychology. But like, I take them seriously and I'll ask like what makes you think that? What have you experienced? What are your thoughts? And then like what I like to do is straight up, I'll whip out the DSM-5. Open up the page and let's go through it together, and then we'll just talk about it. And I think that's helpful for both me and them to kind of gauge like, okay, is this something that we want to explore further or maybe not, right? And also I think usually like what's behind that is like, well, like what makes you question that, right? Like there must be a reason. And even if it may not be like necessarily ADHD, is like your forgetfulness or like whatever it is, like how bothersome is that? What impact does that have in your life? Like, and we can still address those things, whether, diagnosis or not.
So as a therapist and as a human, I noticed that you've done a lot of work on yourself, just based on the types of therapy you've been through, your ADHD evaluation, like your reflection of your childhood, what you like to do. And oftentimes when I do this podcast, the main question I always get is, how did you get to be so reflective? Or how did you get to be so understanding and articulate about your experience? And I don't want to miss out on that question because I'm thinking that about you right now, just how much work and effort this type of work for you took.
Honestly, I think a lot of it has to do with my experiences as the child of an EIP.
Wow.
Because one of the things that like in that book that I mentioned, one of the ways of coping styles that's mentioned is internalizing. And so a lot of like what a lot of children of EIP will do is internalize the problem. They'll look to themselves to see like, what is it that I'm doing that's causing this problem, or what role am I playing that's exacerbating their anger or rage or whatever. Like, what can I do differently? And while, that can really lower your self-esteem and cause a lot of like, it's a lot of self-blame essentially. I think I did a lot of that when I was younger, but I think I've turned it into a strength by kind of balancing out the self-blame and like the shame and the lack of like asking other people to take accountability or responsibility for things that they should. So balancing kind of that out with the reflectiveness. So I think before it wasn't so much reflectiveness, but more of just like self-blame and a lot of like bottling things up. But now, like after having done like a lot of, work, I've kind of turned it into more of a reflectiveness.
I like that perspective, because if someone's listening to this, and this is even my experience as someone who grew up with a parent with a personality disorder, I think that the strength I got from going through that adversity was that I actually learned how to communicate at an early age. And I learned how to deal with really difficult emotions at an early age. And then that's the reason why I turned to books and like I turned to mentorship. And I've gotten to be very open and transparent about my experiences and what I need to work on. Because I was going through like, I'm not an addict, but I love going through like the 12 steps of like surrendering your addiction. And like, I think I don't have the addiction of substance use, but I do have the addiction of like wanting and seeking approval. And so just giving it over to a higher power, and also understanding that like at some point our adversities can work for us and not against us if we actually have awareness around it. And like, because I love, the reason why I love your story, Mina, is you have learned from the experience. I think that like one of the things I always hear from people who have been through it is they've allowed their trauma to become them. And like, how did you get there? Because I know that was probably a journey, right? Of like being able to accept, okay, what did I learn from this experience?
Yeah. Well, 3 things came to mind.
Yeah, please.
As you were talking. First of all, I just want to say that so you mentioned that you like going through the 12 steps, right?
Yeah.
Like the AA 12 steps. I find that so interesting because as part of my training, I was required to attend a meeting of AA and of Al-Anon.
Yeah.
And for those of you who don't know, Al-Anon is for loved ones of people who suffer from, or struggle with like alcohol abuse and things like that. And what Al-Anon is all about is about letting go of control.
Yes.
Like, it's not so much about like, how do I help my loved ones stop, drinking or, be sober, but it's about how do I let go of my need to control them?
Yes.
Anyway, yeah, I just thought of that.
That is so cool. Have you heard of Whitney Cummings? She's this really famous comedian.
Never mind.
Not Cummings, the writer. Whitney Cummings, the comedian. So she's this female comedian whose dad was an alcoholic, and she attended Al-Anon meetings, and she also discovered that she had a ton of her own addictions, codependency, workaholism. And she argues that everyone has some sort of addiction, whether or not you replace it with something different. And she has this joke where she went like, I would give up brushing my teeth so that the person that I was with wouldn't like abuse drugs. I knew Spanish for don't come near my partner with that heroin more than I knew like conversational Spanish. So I don't know. I think that like in our culture today, I think that the recovery model is really helpful because it creates humility, but I digress.
Yeah. And I think the concept of Al-Anon is really helpful for like people like us, like people of EIP, because I think a lot of that, a lot of the tendencies or like the survival techniques really that we learn as children of EIP is meant to manipulate and control in a way, right? Like,
wow, I never thought of it that way.
Yeah, like we're doing things or not doing things to avoid upsetting them or to avoid their scrutiny or to avoid their abuse, right? Oof. So, I mean, essentially that is a survival technique and it is also manipulation. And that is also you trying to exercise control as a child. And so I think that helped me a lot to just let go of like, my dad is who he is. Like, no matter what I do, I can't satisfy him. And that's okay. Like, I don't need to.
Yeah.
So that was one thing that I realized. Hold on. I'm having a brain fart.
It's okay. Take your time. You said 3 things.
Okay, one thing. So another thing that I want to say is that like I still am working through so much. Like I still am a huge people pleaser. I call myself like a people pleaser in recovery. I still do like repeat a lot of like unhealthy cycles and patterns in relationships. I still, carry a lot of shame and self-blame and like while like right now I feel like I'm pretty well managed, like I know that I am also prone to depression and anxiety. So I am still working through a lot. So yeah, so I just wanted to caveat that by saying like I still am working, like work in progress. But I think what has helped me to like continue to work through that is really just like thinking of it as a continuous work in progress, a lifelong journey. Like there is no like, okay, I've reached my destination, I'm fully realized and actualized, you know, I'm perfect now. There's none of that. So I just kind of think of it as like I'm just continuously working on myself. And another thing is, honestly, if I'm being super honest, I just hit a low point and there's nowhere else to go but up. Like, you know, like yeah, like I think just coming out of like my childhood and coming out of like living with my parents, I just realized like, dang, I'm really depressed. I'm anxious. I'm a huge people pleaser, codependent, and just emotionally, I was in so much pain. And, you know, I was even having like suicidal thoughts, and I just like I felt like what was my rock bottom emotionally. And like from there, it's just like, okay, now I got to work through it.
Dang, that's so good, Mina.
Yeah. So I think while not ideal or fun, it was what helped me to, or one of the things that helped me to just like continue working, chugging along. Yeah. And I think just kind of taking away the pressure of like, oh, I have to become a fully like actualized adult helps a lot. Just thinking of it as like, you know, improving in baby steps. And just thinking about like one goal or like one intention at a time. Like for this year, I told myself my intention for the year is to be more freely expressive and honest and authentic of like my feelings, my thoughts. And that's kind of also part of my whole like people pleaser recovery journey.
I like that. We're all in a recovery. Thanks, Mina. This was a really fun interview.
Yeah, this was really fun. Thank you.
Yeah.
And as a side note, I just want to say that I really admire how much you read because I've always wanted to be a reader, and there's so many books that I want to read and learn from and that I buy and I don't read.
You know what, I go through seasons of reading. So like I'll be on a podcast binge and then I'll just lose interest in a podcast and then I'll go into the audiobook. So right now I'm kind of into like really, because I'm Christian, so I'm into like spiritual practices and prayer. And like because we're in a season of Lent right now, I'm kind of reading listening to an audible book on prayer. And then at night I'll like read, but that's like figuring out what your process is, you know? But yeah. All right. If you've made it to the end of the episode, I think you deserve a thank you. Yellow Chair Collective, the podcast, wouldn't be anything without followers like you. I promise you that the production of these podcasts will continue to increase as the listeners increase and the followers increase. And so if you can do me a favor, if you found any value from this podcast episode, please give this a like, share, or subscribe to the show. It really helps us out. It keeps the word going and it helps our impressions. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next Friday.